upper left-hand corner. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, to the Ways and Means fiscal briefing. Today we have David Romans, Teresa Tazinski, and maybe one other. I don't see you on my first page here, but I'm sure Mr. Romans is beginning for our fiscal briefing today. So good morning again to all the members, and thank you all for providing us this briefing today.
Good morning. Thank you. I think we're going to put the document up on the screen.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right, so we have a rather long document. We're going to give you kind of an overview with a quick look, which is about 5 pages, and I have a couple of other charts that might be of interest on specific topics. And then we'll wrap up with Teresa, who's our revenue and economy expert, talking a little bit about the state revenues and where we've been with the economy. So just to start off on this first slide, the budget is about $49.4 billion. It's actually a decrease from fiscal 21 of about $1 billion. Now, why is that? It's because federal funds go way down, as you can see in that chart at the top. Federal funds are down for 2 reasons. The CARES Act.
Look at the bill that came through this morning. Yes. I guess I walked through there.
Madam Chair, your microphone isn't turned off.
Thanks. So the federal funds are down because of the CARES Act, money being in fiscal 21, but not in 22. As well as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. The state budget assumes that the caseload for SNAP will drop quite a bit in fiscal 22 as the economy recovers. And that substantially reduces the amount of federally funded SNAP dollars coming into the state. So that's why the budget goes down overall. As you see, the general fund actually grows by over $1 billion. And the governor's spending plan leaves a fund balance at the end of the current year of about $265 million. And at the end of fiscal 22 of about $193 million. It's notable that what is not in this budget right now is the December federal stimulus that Congress approved. That money will likely be added in a supplemental budget in the next month, and some of it may even come in through budget amendments that the budget committees will review. So that money is over $1 billion of federal money that will be added to the 21 and 22 budgets. The budget also makes no assumptions about any further federal stimulus. As you know, President Biden has proposed a very large stimulus package. So we will see. But the budget you see at the end of session could be quite a lot different if there's an additional federal stimulus and that money is also added to the budget. Let's go to the next slide. All right, this top chart shows you one of the key elements of the governor's funding plan is tax relief proposals. It's really the biggest initiative in his budget.
David, can you zoom in? Is that possible?
Your staff's controlling it, so I will.
Oh, we're scroll. Oh, okay.
Here you go. Is that better? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so stay at the top there. So the Governor's Relief Act, which you've certainly heard a little bit about, will reduce revenues quite a bit in fiscal 21, as you can see. And there's 3 key elements. One is repealing the state and local income taxes on unemployment benefits. It reduces revenues by about 50 million in fiscal 21 and 20 million in 22. Second component is stimulus payments for people who receive the earned income tax credit in either tax year 2019 or tax year 2020. They could get up to $750 if they got the tax credit in both years. For a family, $450 for an individual. You can see that costs about $267 million to the general fund. And then there's a sales tax vendor credit of up to $3,000 per month for 4 months. So to qualify, a business has to have sales of $100,000 or less. And they would get to retain up to $3,000 of the sales tax that they collected on those sales in that month. And that would go into effect the month immediately following whenever the bill is passed. So those are sort of the parts of the governor's tax relief that are responding to the pandemic. The other components are a number of things that you've seen before. There's going to be a bill related to military retirement income that will reduce revenues by about 18 million. A Hometown Heroes bill that will reduce revenues by about 7 million. And then expanding the research and development tax credit by about 6.5 million. And then finally, it won't affect fiscal 22, But perhaps the biggest tax component of his plan is phasing out income tax on retirement income beginning in fiscal 2023. By fiscal 2026, that reduces ongoing revenues by more than $300 million. So that's a very significant ongoing impact. Let's scroll down to the bottom part of that, the page with the other chart. Yeah, perfect. So you might ask, well, how does this all come together into a balancing plan? So before the legislative initiatives in terms of tax relief and before the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, which the governor has introduced, are taken into account, the budget would be out of balance by about 188 million in fiscal 22. And then as you can see in the chart, we account for the various tax relief provisions. And then what brings it all together and puts us into balance as a state is the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, which has over $1 billion of actions to help balance the budget. Most of those, over 800 million, are spending reductions against mandates in state law. But while that sounds like a very large number, more than half of it is cutting the amount of funds in the rainy day fund that are put into the amount of funding that's put into the rainy day fund in fiscal 22. So he's cutting 422 million of the required appropriation to the rainy day fund. Even doing that, the governor still leaves nearly $1 billion in the rainy day fund, which is 5% of general fund revenues. We'll go through some of the other cuts more in a few pages. The other broad area is transfers and revenues, about 224 million. There's two big items here. The first is the governor is diverting 101 million of the transfer tax revenues for fiscal 22 to the general fund. And he is backfilling that with general obligation bonds to pay for open space and other programs that would normally be supported with the transfer tax. So it's backfilled dollar for dollar in the capital budget. The other item is a few years back, the General Assembly passed a bill that sets aside sort of extraordinary revenues from things like capital gains if they're unusually high versus our past experience, so that we don't build our budget on money that's very volatile and could drop if the economy slows down. The provision in law would set aside about 80 million of what would otherwise be general fund revenues in fiscal 22. The administration is proposing to ignore that law for this year and giving you 80 million more to spend in fiscal 22. So that's how they end up with a fund balance of 193 million or so. We can go to the next slide. All right, so this graphic shows you the Legislative Services estimate of the structural budget outlook. So structural budget, just as a reminder, is ongoing revenues versus ongoing spending. So we ignore all the fund balance transfers and one-time spending, things like that. And you can see the governor's proposal for fiscal 22 on a structural basis is slightly out of balance, but very close, just 76 million short. Spending Affordability Committee goal for fiscal 22 was to be within 700 million. So the governor has easily met the spending affordability goal. And in the out years, you can see the outlook gets a little worse in the 400 to 500 million range. A big part of that is the phase out of the retirement income that I talked about. If you didn't do that, the structural budget outlook would be very, very good in the out years. And even this outlook is better than many of the outlooks we've been showing you in the last 5 or 6 years. Can we scroll down on that page a little bit, please? Thank you. Okay, so we do want to give you some highlights of what's in the budget. K-12 education. So the formulas are fully funded. In addition, the governor is taking money from the Blueprint Fund and using it to fund a couple of enhancements, if you will. The first is $214 million to hold harmless all the school systems so that their funding grows in fiscal 22. Because statewide, we've seen a significant enrollment decline, most of the school systems would have seen significant decreases in their funding in fiscal 22. So this 214 million holds them harmless. In addition, the governor is proposing to use 152 million of Blueprint funds in fiscal 22 for supplemental instruction and tutoring. And it seems that this is designed to help try to catch students up who've been falling behind due to the pandemic. The other, and the next bullet, the other item noteworthy in terms of the Blueprint Fund is that in fiscal 20, when we closed out, and then again in the current fiscal year, Education Trust Fund revenues that support education aid are falling short of the original estimates, particularly in fiscal 2020 when the casinos were closed, during the initial part of the pandemic. So we sent money out to the school systems, assuming that that revenue was going to come in, and then we never got the revenue. So what the governor is doing is backfilling that shortfall in education trust fund revenues with blueprint funds. And that is authorized in the BRFA because that is not otherwise an allowable use of the blueprint funds. In terms of healthcare providers, the governor is accelerating a planned 4% rate increase that would have gone into effect July 1. He's accelerated it to January 1 of this year. That affects most healthcare providers, particularly those serving the developmentally disabled and people with behavioral health needs, but also a number of other providers who serve the Medicaid population. In terms of temporary cash assistance, which is our cash assistance program for some of our poorest residents in the state, the governor has proposed a temporary increase of the benefit of $100 per recipient per month for 6 months, so January through June of this calendar year. Let's go to the next page. Great, thank you. So in terms of local aid, most of the funding formulas are fully funded. There's 2 exceptions. One is community colleges. Community college funding was supposed to grow by about $41 million this year, more than 10%. The governor is only providing 14 million of that increase. He's cutting 27 million in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act. So this is a cut that if the General Assembly doesn't like it, you can undo in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act. He's also made a small cut to the City of Annapolis grant, so like $300,000 or $400,000 cut. And as he's proposed in many previous years, increasing the share of the State Department of Assessments and Taxation's administrative costs that are borne by county governments, which shift about $4 million in costs in fiscal 22. Again, that's a Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act. Actually, all of the local aid cuts here are Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act provisions, so they can all be undone by the General Assembly. Higher education, University System of Maryland tuition growth is held to 2% for in-state students. The Selinger formula for the non-public higher education institutions is frozen, which saves the state $30 million. Again, that's a BRFA action. I'm sure there'll be discussion about that given the magnitude of the cut. State personnel, there is no general salary increase guaranteed for state employees in fiscal 22. What the governor has done is he's negotiated with certain bargaining units that they could get a $500 bonus and a 1% salary increase later in fiscal 22 if fiscal 21 revenues exceed certain targets. Notable in this negotiation is that AFSCME, which is the largest bargaining unit, did not agree to this, and so right now they would be eligible for no adjustments, even if the revenue targets are met. Capital budget is $1.1 billion in general obligation bonds. This is what was expected by the Spending Affordability Committee. That's also supplemented by about $244 million of bond premiums that are also going to fund capital projects. So it's a pretty healthy, robust capital program this year. And about $313 million of the capital spending goes for school construction, as noted in that last bullet. One thing I would note is that the governor set aside no money for legislative bond initiatives. So the budget committees will have to make some cuts to the governor's program or find some money elsewhere in order to fund your various bond initiatives. We can go to the next slide. Thanks. Oh yeah, we're just raising some various policy issues here in terms of things for the budget committees to focus on in session. I'll just note one, because it is education related. The boost program is raised from 7.4 million to 10 million in the governor's budget, which is a similar proposal that he's made in prior years, and the General Assembly usually cuts that back. So I think we can go on to the next slide. All right, so the next couple of pages show you all the detail on the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act. I've talked about a lot of the revenue and any other legislation that's incorporated into the governor's budget. I've talked about a lot of the revenue items. I would note here at the bottom of the page, you can see the rainy day fund cut that I mentioned, as well as the governor is saving about $44 million by delaying repayment of some program open space diversions that happened in the past. There's a couple other notable cuts on the next slide. If we can go to the next slide. Yeah, I just would note right up there at the top of the page, you can see the other contingent cuts in the BRFA. And you can see, as I mentioned earlier, the two biggest ones are that Selinger formula and the Cade Community College formula. That's where most of the significant cuts that I think will get a lot of attention from the budget committees are. And then under the fund swaps lower down there, you can see there was a big action, $200 million has been taken from the health exchanges reinsurance program and being used to fund Medicaid. Now, the health exchange has a large balance in that reinsurance program. This was supposed to help sort of subsidize costs for the health insurers in the individual market so that more people would join it. We've been getting so much federal money for that same purpose that we haven't been using the state funds that were set aside. So they've built up a large fund balance, and the governor is choosing to use it to help support the Medicaid program this year. All right, let's go on. We got to go on to the next slide, please. And we can skip this one actually, so let's keep going. Okay, I wanted to give you a really brief look at the Blueprint Fund, as this will get a lot of attention this session. So the first part of this chart shows the activity in the Blueprint Fund. And really what it's showing, the second and third lines in there, first shows you the amount of money that goes into the Education Trust Fund lockbox each year. And you can see that keeps growing until 2023 when all of the ETF money goes into the lockbox. And that money is dedicated to education enhancements only. And then there's the money that goes to the Blueprint Fund, which is money from marketplace facilitators, a lot of online sales tax money, and so forth. And that brings in about $500 million a year throughout the period shown. So you basically have about $1 billion a year going into being set aside for education enhancements. And in fiscal 22, the governor is spending about $750 million of that. In the out years, there's really no commitments in statute for significant enhancements. So we're showing very little being spent out of that pot. And you can see you end up with a very huge, large balance in the Blueprint Fund, which could be used to fund education enhancements or diverted elsewhere. So then the question obviously is, well, what happens if you override the governor's veto on the Kerwin bill? And so that lower part of the chart shows this. It takes into account three pieces of legislation: the sales tax and digital downloads that was passed last session and the governor vetoed, but the revenue, if it was overridden, is dedicated to the Blueprint Fund, so it would help the Blueprint Fund. Second, there's the actual Blueprint bill, the Kerwin bill. And third, the Built to Learn Act, the school construction bill from last year, becomes law if the Kerwin veto is overridden. So we've built that into this estimate. All told, as you can see, starting in fiscal 23, costs would go up by over $1 billion a year in education spending. The Blueprint Fund is actually able to absorb all of that cost increase through fiscal 25. It's only in fiscal 26 when the general fund would start having to supplement the Blueprint Fund at about $195 million in fiscal 26. That number would grow quite a bit in future years as the Kerwin bill continues to be rolled out. But anyway, it does show that in the near term, the veto override would not create any additional fiscal stress for the general fund. All right, let's go to the next page. All right, we did want to show you how the Blueprint money in the fiscal 22 budget is being used relative to what was in the current year's budget. I've talked about the hold harmless, the $214 million increase. Concentration of poverty gets an additional $7 million to incorporate more schools into the program. The tutoring money that I talked about, the $152 million, is the other big enhancement. The other notable changes here, you see the pre-K supplemental grants go down. That's because enrollment is down. So it's not a policy decision, it's just enrollment being down. Early education funding grows for a variety of different programs. There's a bunch of small different initiatives in there by about $9 million. And then you can see declining enrollment grants, about $7.6 million. Those are subsumed by that hold harmless grant. So there's no money putting into declining enrollment. So that's really what the activity in the Blueprint Fund is. I think we can go on to the next slide. All right, I'm going to skip through this because this was more detail on the Relief Act. You're going to see the bill, so you'll have plenty of opportunity to hear all the details of the Relief Act. The last thing I'm going to talk about before Teresa talks about revenues is the federal stimulus money we've received. So this graphic shows you there's been $30 billion of money coming into Maryland to help respond to the pandemic. Almost all of this money is federal money. Is about $250 million of state money that the governor took out of the rainy day fund. And I think what the chart shows you is the bulk of the money, over $18 billion, has gone for business assistance, mainly through the federal Paycheck Protection Program. I should note the blue bars show you the CARES Act money and the state money, and the yellow bars are the December stimulus money. So you can see there's in the business assistance area over there on the left, there's more Paycheck Protection money, but not as much as came back in the spring. And then you can see there's substantial money, of course, has gone into the health area, as well as transportation. About half of the transportation money went to WMATA. And then there's also money in public schools and higher ed and various other places. Now, what is not shown in this chart is two things. Unemployment benefits, that Teresa will talk about, but we've gotten close to $8 billion of federal unemployment benefits for our citizens. And the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, where we've gotten probably an extra $1 billion because of the higher SNAP caseloads. That's all federally funded. So those two things are not here. So when you add those in, we've gotten close to $40 billion of federal stimulus money. All right, let's go to the next slide. This just shows you the nitty-gritty detail on the December stimulus. So this is money that really hasn't come into the budget and largely hasn't come into the economy. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. Under that second grouping, K-12 education, $869 million for the public schools. 90% of it under federal law will go directly to the school systems based on Title I enrollment. The state can retain 10% for other purposes. We haven't seen all the details of what the MSDE plan is. In K-12 education, the governor has two flexible pots. One is about $20 million that he can allocate for really anything education related. And he actually issued a press release yesterday, sending some of that to community colleges, some of it to K-12 schools to help with reopening, and supporting a couple other small initiatives. And then there's a governor's fund money that federal law reserves for non-public schools, $38 million. It can't be for things like scholarships. It has to be for responding to kind of costs they incurred due to the pandemic. And we have not seen any detail yet on how the governor plans to allocate that money. One other thing I'll just mention that's notable here is rental assistance, which has been a big issue in the state. There's about $400 million available from the federal government. A lot of that is going to go directly to the large counties. The smaller counties, the money will pass through the state, but it will help provide some relief to renters who are having trouble paying their bills. With that, I'm kind of done talking about the budget. Teresa's going to talk about the revenues. I don't know if the chair would like to do questions now. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much for that. We do have one waiting, and maybe there'll be others, starting with Delegate Lutke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. David, thank you as always for the great analysis and presentation. If we could go back for a second to the governor's revenue proposals, which you mentioned towards the beginning of your presentation, and specifically the exemption of UI income from taxation. The numbers you provided us today, are those in the governor's budget or those the DLS analysis?
Yeah, let's go back to page 2, I think it was. Yeah, so the numbers in here are based on the governor's plan. And yeah, so let me explain this. I'm glad you asked that. So the fiscal note on the Relief Act came out today. It was the Senate's hearing the bill today. And it has substantially larger state impact numbers on the unemployment benefit number. And when I say substantially, I mean like 150 million larger in fiscal 21. So what's important to understand is what the administration numbers reflect is how they think their bill impacts the official revenue estimate of the state. And they think that the BRE estimate, and the BRE agrees with this, only really accounted for about 50 million of revenue from unemployment benefit taxation in fiscal 21. So it turns out we would have gotten a lot more, but the BRE missed that. So the fiscal note really is showing you the foregone revenue, how much revenue we won't get because of the bill. But in terms of the official revenue estimate of the state, these numbers are more accurate.
Okay, but the fiscal note on the bill itself is significantly higher than what we're seeing here.
Correct. Correct.
And that include, I mean, you mentioned the state numbers. Does that include local, like the county piggyback taxes too?
There's a significant, these numbers here are just the state numbers. The fiscal note does show the county numbers, and they are quite significant. The large counties like Montgomery County and Prince George's County lose about 25 million apiece in fiscal 21.
All right, thank you.
If there are no other questions.
Next, we have Delegate Wilkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just wanted to thank Mr. Romans for his responsiveness and answering questions from me over the interim and over the last couple of weeks. Mr. Romans, I just wanted to walk through, I'm just always fascinated and interested in the kind of the mechanics of our budgeting process. And I wanted to understand with this unique circumstance with us being in session and these federal funds that will be rolling in, what is the actual process and how will it work? Now that we already have the governor's budget, let's, the millions of dollars that are going to be coming in, is that going to go in? Does it have to be a budget amendment? How will those sort of be considered, the actual mechanics of how those will be considered? And also, since these are federal funds, if we wanted to mandate for this current fiscal year, which we normally couldn't do with other funds, how and can we do that and how?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's in the normal way we do things, there's two ways federal funds can get added to the budget. One is that the governor could submit a supplemental budget later this session, adding the December stimulus money and any additional money that Congress approves in the next couple of months. That is, I think, the preferred method. And then the General Assembly gets to review how the governor's proposing to spend it, and you can add language restricting the money for certain purposes, or you could cut it if you're not happy with what he's proposing. And it sounds like with the December stimulus, the administration plans to do it that way, to do a supplemental budget. The other way money can be added is through what we call the budget amendment process, which is outside of the normal budget process. It doesn't go through legislation. It's just they submit a letter to the budget committee saying, we're going to add some federal money that we've gotten, and here's how we're going to spend it. And the budget committees get 45 days to review and comment on that, but they don't have any ability to block that spending. So I think one of the concerns from sort of a legislative oversight standpoint is the governor could choose, especially with money that comes later in session, to just use the budget amendment process, even doing it after session, and spend any additional stimulus however he chooses. So the only way really for the General Assembly to intervene, if it wants to intervene, would be to pass some sort of emergency bill changing the budget amendment process to give it a little bit more control, or to limit what the governor can bring the money in for. So I think that's something that has to be talked about over the next few weeks in the General Assembly.
A follow-up, Delegate Wilkins, Delegate Barnes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, David, for the presentation. I wanted to go to page 14, where you had rental assistance for $402 million, and just trying to understand what is that breakdown of that money to the different jurisdictions, because as you know, every jurisdiction is impacted differently. And I know within Prince George's County, we have been impacted greatly by rental that need assistance.
I do not have off the top of my head the county by county allocations. It is sort of based on federal rules. As I said, the large jurisdictions like Prince George's would be able to get their money directly from the feds. So we'll try to get for you and send to you the amount. We'll send it to the whole committee, the amount by county that would be received, but it's based on federal allocation. It's not a state decision.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Back to you, Delegate Lutke.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I just forgot to turn off my Smurf hand.
Gotcha. All right. Any other questions? If not, we'll go back to Ms. Tazinski's part of the presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If we could go to the next slide. Yeah, we'll start here with the economy. Of course, the economy last year contracted very sharply in the second quarter when the pandemic began. And although the economy began to improve in late spring, early summer, by the end of the year, both Maryland and the US economy was really still in the grips of a pretty significant recession. And this chart shows you a couple key metrics for the Maryland economy by month, so you can see how the year played out. Starting with the labor market, which was the most directly impacted by the pandemic. We start with both the year-over-year percent change, which is the first column, and the second column is the difference in total employment in the state relative to the end of 2019. And although we picked up some jobs in the first couple months, things of course went very south after that. In April, the worst of the situation there, we were down 375,000 jobs relative to just 4 months earlier. So it's a very, very sharp contraction. And after April, we did begin adding jobs every month since then. But you can see on your chart, the version of your chart you had, by November, we were still down about 130,000 jobs. Now this morning, the US Department of Labor released the data for the states for the month of December. And we did, nationally, employment fell in December. You may have seen headlines about that. That's December versus November. But Maryland actually picked up about 5,000 jobs. So at the end of the year there, we're down about 125,000 jobs from where we were at the end of 2019. Along with that, of course, the unemployment rate went up very high, peaking at 10.1% in April. It then came down, you can see, to 6.8% in November. The number for December was 6.3%. That's still quite elevated. As a point of reference, during the Great Recession, the peak unemployment rate in the Great Recession was 7.8%. As David alluded to, the result of the high unemployment was a significant amount of unemployment insurance benefits being paid out. The monthly data here is for the regular state unemployment insurance program, about $1.73 billion through November. I don't have that data for December yet. If we could scroll down a little bit on this chart, you can see, in addition to the regular state benefits, there were, of course, a variety of federal actions to both enhance the benefit, extend the benefit, and open up the program to people who normally don't qualify. So they added that extra $600 per week through the month of July. They added a federally funded paid 13 extra weeks on top of regular UI. So if you exhausted your 26 weeks of regular state UI, you got another 13 weeks funded by the federal government. And of course, they expanded the program to people who are self-employed or contractors or gig workers who normally do not qualify for unemployment insurance at all. So in total, from March through December, according to the Maryland Department of Labor, about $7.7 billion of federal money was spent on unemployment insurance benefits for people in Maryland. That's a very, very significant support for those people, allowing them to pay their bills. And in turn, it becomes a significant support for the Maryland economy. Now, one part of the economy that actually did fairly well is the last two columns, which is the housing market. The housing market, both in terms of the first column is sales, the second column is the median home price. It did contract sharply in the spring, sales, but then it began to grow, and it grew by the end of the year quite strongly. Sales up well into double digits. And part of this is due to really record low mortgage rates, which still are very low even now. There has been a fair amount of demand from people, all of us at home teleworking. Some people realized they didn't live in the best place for teleworking and began to look for, bigger places with yards and stuff. And there's also a demographic tailwind to the housing market. The millennial generation, which is quite large, has really begun to hit their prime home buying age. And so even without record low mortgage rates, there was a pretty substantial demographic support for the housing market. This has resulted in a fairly sizable increase in the median home price, which is going to start to probably weigh on affordability as we move forward. And And you can see, again, by the end of the year, double-digit growth in the median home price. So this is, I should say, is data from the Maryland Association of Realtors. Part of this is due to not only that demand, but also just really, really low inventory of homes for sales. And that has contributed to the price increase. Now, this seems incongruous to have high unemployment and also a strong housing market. And that goes to one of the key features of the economy last year. And if we can go to the next slide, we have some data to kind of illustrate this. You've probably maybe seen in the paper talk of a K-shaped recovery or a bifurcated economy. And the reality is that although unemployment was up pretty significantly, the impact was not spread evenly across the economy and was in fact quite concentrated. To illustrate that, this data is from the Comptroller's Office. It's state and local income tax withholding, mostly from paychecks, for the whole calendar year now, 2020 compared to 2019. And we've split it up. They were able to split it up by broad kind of industry categories. And at the bottom, you can see total withholding was actually up 5.1% for the calendar year. Some of that was because of the government. The government, even if we take out the withholding from that large increase in unemployment insurance benefits, was still up 5.54%. This is federal, state, and local government. The federal government actually added jobs in Maryland last year, some of which, but not all of which, was related to temporary hiring for the census. There also was a 3.1% federal COLA for federal employees in 2020, so that helped contribute to their strong growth. Amongst the private sector, we have divided it into industries where withholding increased and those where withholding decreased. Amongst the increasing industries are some very large industries like professional and business services and retail trade, and also some very high-paying industries like finance and insurance. Retail trade might be a little surprising to see that going up. Some aspects of retail trade have been hit pretty hard, but others have done very well. Obviously, online retailers have done very well as home improvement stores, grocery stores. So on net, the retail trade sector was actually positive in terms of withholding growth. The private sector that saw declines were just where you would expect them to be. So accommodation and food service, that's hotels and motels, as well as restaurants and bars, just getting hammered by the recession and a big drop in withholding. And arts and recreation and entertainment, that includes, well, the casinos are in this category. It also includes sports and like performing arts, museums, fitness centers, gyms, those sort of places also being hit hard, as well as not quite as hard, but the personal and repair services, which would include dry cleaners, hair salons, spas, that sort of thing. But in total, importantly, the private sector in total is up 2.7%. So those increasing industries more than offset the decline in the declining industries. And I should say, as everybody I'm sure is aware, a lot of those declining industries have fairly low wages, the restaurant and hotel industry, and some of the industries within the arts and recreation. So our highest paid industries were the ones that continued to grow. Some of the lowest paid industries have been those that have been hit hardest. And if we can scroll down to so we can see the bottom of the chart. So in total, as I mentioned, withholding was up 5.1. If we exclude the UI benefits, it's still up 3.4. So you can think of this as withholding from actual underlying wages. There were some local rate increases of a pretty substantial amount, including in some big counties. If we make an adjustment for that, we still get withholding growth of 2.5%. And this has been a really key factor. Withholding is far and away the largest part of our personal income tax, and the personal income tax is far and away the biggest piece of our general fund revenues. So the fact that withholding, even with everything that happened last year, managed to still grow was a big reason why, although general fund revenues are considerably below where they were when we were in session last year, for example, where they were expected to be when we were in session last year, they're not as bad as was feared when the pandemic began in the spring. And if we can go to the next slide, and this is my last slide here about the actual general fund revenue forecast. As you probably know, the Board of Revenue Estimates issued a new revenue forecast in December, and this compares it to their previous forecast in September. Overall, it was a pretty small upward revision, just 64 million or 0.3% in fiscal 21, a somewhat larger revision in fiscal 22. There was a very slight improvement in the economic outlook between September and December. The biggest change, though, was in the forecast of capital gains income, which of course is very important for the personal income tax. In September, the board had relied on a capital gains forecast from Moody's Analytics, one of the private consulting companies the state contracts with. And they had a really bearish forecast for capital gains, not only in calendar 20, but also in calendar 21. And by the time the board got to December, it was pretty clear that forecast was not correct. And in fact, as you're probably aware, the market did really well in 2020. And in fact, the S&P 500, for example, ended the year up 16%. So that revision accounts for a lot of the revision in the personal income tax. The other factor the board considered was year-to-date performance, which was actually did fairly well. In certain cases, like the lottery was doing quite well, even before the recent really large jackpots in Powerball and Mega Millions. So there was an upward revision to lottery, and same with the insurance premium tax. Other things, however, were revised down that have been doing poorly, like the estate and inheritance tax, the district courts, and interest earnings. Interest rates, of course, are very, very low, and our interest earnings for the state are very low. The last thing on this chart is some selected special funds that relate to education funding. The Blueprint Fund, as Dave mentioned, gets a chunk of money from the sales tax related to some certain online sales. These are online retailers who began to collect the sales tax after the Supreme Court's decision in Wayfair. And also there was a bill in the 2019 session that requires marketplace facilitators to collect the sales tax on third-party sales on their websites. And that money is dedicated, not all of that money, the general fund gets the first 100 million of that pot of money, and then the rest goes to the Blueprint. And you can see there was an upward revision to that as online sales continue to grow very, very strongly. And there is in fiscal 21 only a distribution to the Blueprint Fund from corporate filing fees, which are normally only a general fund revenue source. This was a provision in the 2019 Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act. And then the last thing that helps to fund education, of course, is the casino money into the Education Trust Fund. There's a very small downward revision to that here in December, and basically no change in the fiscal 22 estimate. And that's all I have on the economy and revenues, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. Any questions from members on this section? Seeing none, let's move to the next section.
Actually, that's pretty much all we wanted to cover. The rest of the document just goes into much more nitty-gritty detail on a lot of the things we've already talked about. So we're happy to answer any other questions you have about the budget. Otherwise, we're done.
All right, I'm just waiting a few more seconds to see if anyone has any questions. Looking like we do not. So thank you both very much. Appreciate it. Thank you to the members. We'll be back at 1:30 for our